Good morning. God be with you. So glad you are here. There's about 40 of us in this room and another 15 or so online. So if you don't mind waving, people in the room, the people online, we know that you are somewhere in the country, around the world, maybe under a palm tree, maybe in hospital, maybe at home. We welcome you, whoever you are, wherever you're at. I'm so delighted that you've come on. This is a balmy, warm February day. It's like, bring out the thongs. It's incredible. So glad you're here. This is the second of our Going Deeper opportunities together. Hillhurst United Church is over 115 years old, and the day that it opened, they had an article in the Herald that said, 7-day-a-week church opens in Kensington. And so here we are on this Saturday gathering to learn together. As a affirming community of faith, we recognize and welcome all people, regardless of age, stage, gender, or sexual orientation. These pews say you belong, so we hope you feel you belong. I want to give thanks to Elaine and Nancy, who are here somewhere, for their hospitality. Thank you. Fabulous breakfast that we'll invite you to help yourself to throughout the morning. So just help yourself that way. We also give thanks that prior to our being here, there are many different nations that walked and lived on this land, cultivating, taking care, sharing their rituals and stories of Treaty 7 land as we meet in Calgary at the convergence of the Elbow and the Bow River. And so we remember and seek to enter into truth and reconciliation as we learn about those who are here before us. Our 4 practices here are hospitality, and so I've told you that food is there, eating and drinking together. There'll be opportunities with Henry and to engage us together in this room, and so we welcome you to at different points move as you need to. Spirituality, this is an opportunity to nurture your soul. I was saying to Henry on the way here, I think of Hillhurst as about a third United Church that has grew up that way. I discovered not long ago that my house, where I was born in Welland, Ontario, was actually attached to the church, if you can imagine. So, I grew up in the church, literally. And then there's other people that were formed in other traditions, Catholic, evangelical, Presbyterian, you name it, and other religious traditions, as well as people for whom church is a brand new thing. So we welcome you, knowing that is who we are. Social justice, how do we take what we say and sing out in the world? If we just keep it all in here, we're only doing part of the job. It's to take what we learn out into the world for transformation, and it's grounded in risk. So, welcome this morning. Before we do that, I'm just going to invite you, as we try to do, to engage with people around you. And here's the quick question for a minute and a half. And that question is this: why are you here? So, really invite you to get up and move if you want, but just say why you're here today. Why you're here today. Okay, I hope you've shared that, and we'll have lots of chances. We know some people are a bit more introverted, and that may be hard, but I really believe when we gather in community, we need to have a chance to say who we are. So it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Henry Shiu, who will say something about himself more formally in a moment, but as a person who's been at Emmanuel College, University of Victoria, at University of Toronto, which is where he teaches for the last 5 years. That's my alma mater. And I'm delighted that he's here to help us understand a bit about Buddhism, how it connects to Christianity and other world religions, but most of all to ourselves and our place in the world. One of the things that Henry will help you understand, and myself, is how Buddhism fits. Why is a Christian seminary in Toronto having Buddhists and Muslims and Jews coming together to learn together? And he can say something about that. He came to U of T from Hong Kong when he was 17, literally did a BA, MA, PhD, all of his degrees at U of T, which he can say something about. And I've already had a delightful conversation that almost meant I didn't get here because we were upstairs having a great conversation. I think you will find being with Henry is open and willing to learn and to share what he knows with us. And he just shared with me, I said, "Why are you here?" And he said, "Well, I was asked." But he just shared with me that this is the first time that he has spoken in a church, which I find remarkable that for 5 years in Toronto, I got to talk to the principal, why that is so, but just think about that. And so it's a privilege to have him. You're here to listen and be with Henry, and he'll engage us. And so we are so thrilled that he came in last night, and he'll be here this morning and then tomorrow morning. So I'll let him say a bit about him, but please welcome Dr. Henry Shiu as he comes this morning.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Am I on? That's good. That's good. Good morning, everyone. Louder. Okay. How about now? Yeah, that's good. Good morning, and thank you for the kind words, Reverend Pentland. I was asked to be more casual, so I'll start addressing you as John. Is that okay? Okay, so I'm Henry, and as you heard, this is my first time speaking in a church. So let me share with you a thought that I had when I came in this church this morning. What struck me was the stage that I'm standing on. That reminds me of an experience that I used to have when attending concerts and musical performances. So music is a big part of my life. And while I was in the audience looking up the stage, I always had the thought that, that's not the place that I will set my foot on. You see, did you get that feeling when you are attending a concert? That's for the performers, not for me. So when I was at the door, at the threshold of this sacred space, I had a similar feeling. Am I really going to speak on that stage as a non-Christian, as a Buddhist especially? But here I am because of the kind invitation of John. And I thank you all for coming as well, and those who are attending the event online. So hello to you all in different parts of Canada or in different parts of the world. So welcome. And I also want to share with you that when I first received the invitation, John asked me, what am I going to talk about as a Buddhist? So it didn't really take me long to come up with this topic, what Buddhists can learn from Christians. And John replied in an email very quickly, I think in his usual humor, that, well, what Christians can learn from Buddhists would work too. But I'll stay with what I know best, what Buddhists can learn from Christians. And I also know that many of you attended the presentation by my colleague, Mona Chukwurek-Lafosse, 3 weeks ago. She shared her experience here, very, very positive, and she speaks so enthusiastic about the environment here, and also shared with me the video of her presentation. So I resisted the temptation to watch what she was doing. I was preparing my part, But as I was in the hotel room last night, I could not resist the temptation, so I looked up on YouTube and see what she was doing. Well, she was very good. She was very good, very engaging. She had the stage all to herself. She owned the stage. I'm not like that, so be prepared that you'll find the presentation a bit square, pedantic, boring. Yeah, so I'll share with you something more about Emmanuel College later. Well, can we go to the next slide, please? So the warmth, the welcome that I'm receiving from John and this church, of course, is not possible without the ethos of the United Church of Canada. So I found this on the United Church website. It might be a little too small for you, but at the very top there, under interfaith relations, there is this sentence: God is creatively and redemptively at work in the religious life of all humanity. I really appreciate that. I appreciate that wisdom, that openness. And then further down, it also says that it is actively developing interfaith dialogue with other religions, including Muslim, Hindu, and the Jewish traditions. Well, not the Buddhist yet, but I'll do something with the United Church soon, hopefully. But what I want to do today would not be continuing with the comparisons of the theological differences between the two traditions. Can we have the next slide, please? Well, there is something similar that you'll find in the Buddhist text about the kind of welcoming, the kind of how God is creatively at work with all religious traditions. And that is from a Buddhist scripture known as the Lotus Sutra. It's a very well-known scripture among the Mahayana Buddhists. So let me read it out for you. It's not too long. It's a parable from chapter 5 of the Lotus Sutra. It says that a thick cloud spreads out, covering the whole 1,000 millionfold world, and raining down on every part of it, equally at the same time, its infusions reaching out everywhere. The grass and trees, the shrubs and forests, and the medicinal herbs, whether of small roots, stalks, branches, and leaves, or of middle-sized roots, stalks, branches, and leaves, or of large roots, stalks, branches, and leaves, and also all trees, great and small, whether high, intermediate, or low, all receive some of it. Everything rained on by the same cloud in keeping with its nature, gains in size, and its blossoms and fruits spread out and bloom. Though produced by the same earth and moistened by the same rain, yet the grasses and trees all have their differences. It's not exactly the same message that we found on the UCC website. It is a bit more passive in a sense, that there is out there a kind of ultimate reality. We can call that wisdom, we can call that the divine insight into the reality, we can call that compassion, we can call that in different names. And yet, because of our different dispositions, our spiritual faculty, our spirituality, personalities, characters are all different. So we receive different parts. We develop different interpretations of that truth. So it sounds in a way similar to the message that God is creatively at work with all humankinds of different religious traditions. Even though I would say that the message from the United Church is more active. God is actively at work, creatively at work. Whereas here we are getting a more passive kind of picture that we all receive different parts of this same truth because of our dispositions. Okay. So I won't go on too much about this kind of theological comparison, because there are many remarkable thinkers who have already done that with great depth and wisdom. If you look onto the next slide, you will find some really shining examples. Christian Buddhist dialogues or Buddhist Christian dialogues. What you are seeing here, of course, is the familiar face of the Dalai Lama. And on the left here is a picture of Father Lawrence Freeman. And on the right is, of course, Desmond Tutu, the South African Anglican Archbishop and theologian. And then the next slide, we have other examples with one Christian and two Buddhists. The Christian here is Thomas Merton. The Reverend Thomas Merton is the American Trappist monk. And what you see on the bottom left is actually a picture of the young Dalai Lama. Okay, and above that, on the top left, is a monk whose name was Thich Nhat Hanh, a Vietnamese monk whose name we'll come across again later today. Okay. And then the next slide, there are also shining examples of publications too. On the left here is a book published by Thich Nhat Hanh, really a bestseller, Living Buddha, Living Christ. I believe you can easily find a copy of that on the internet as well. And then on the right is a book written by Cyril Falaeth, who was not only a professor in Indian philosophy and religion, but also a Catholic priest himself. So these are really great works that talks about the differences and similarities between the two religions. And then the next slide, even closer to my own life, two of my professors, Julia Ching and Willa Oxtoby, also published in this area. They were the pioneers in fostering interreligious dialogue within academia, I would say ever since around 1970s or so. Okay. So there is no way I could hope to outshine them in what they did, so I won't even try. But instead, I want to reflect on something more personal. How the teachings of our traditions are lived out in daily practice, and how Buddhist practice might be enriched by the Christian example. Okay? So to begin with, let me introduce myself. I was born and raised in Hong Kong. I came to Canada when I was, as John mentioned, when I was around 17. And all those years, because of the education system in Hong Kong, if my academic results were not too bad, we always considered ourselves as a science student. So we went for the science stream. And it wasn't surprising that when I came to Toronto, came to Canada, I enrolled myself in the engineering program at the U of T, at the University of Toronto. So I was in mechanical engineering. And this year, my oldest son is also applying for the university. And, I think it's karma, that he is also applying for, mechanical engineering. But in my third year of study, I had to take some elective courses. And as a young 18-year-old, 19-year-old, I think it was only natural that I try to pick something that I can be sure I will get a good grade. So something that I would consider easier. And the course that I happened to take was Buddhist philosophy. I had no idea whatsoever what Buddhism was, even though I came from Hong Kong. So that course became the turning point of my life. So instead of focusing on doing all the drills, exercises on mathematical equations or physics or whatnot, for the first time, I was introduced to think about the sufferings in our lives, something more existential, things that I never thought about before. It doesn't mean that I wasn't exposed to religious teachings, but only not in that way. So the next slide will tell you that I am actually no stranger to Christianity. This is the school I attended in Hong Kong. So from kindergarten all the way to the completion of my secondary school in Hong Kong, around 13, 14 years in total, I was studying in a Catholic school. So that's Raimondi College, named after Bishop Timoleon Raimondi, the first vicar apostolic of Hong Kong. So, it still aches me to see the picture of my school. But, the next slide, right across this school, you may still tell the buildings are familiar, from the previous picture on the left side. But very close to the school is the Cathedral of the Immaculate Conception, a very beautiful Gothic structure that opened in 1888. 1888, imagine that. So at the time when I was attending Mass in that cathedral, in my teenage, that was already almost 100 years old. Okay? It was opened not too long after Hong Kong became a British colony. Okay? So 1888. And I guess I'm getting old, and in recent years, nostalgia has a way of creeping in. So I started Googling the places that I grew up, looking around on the Google Maps about these places and how they have become. And some of the older pictures I found on the internet as well. So the next slide will show you this church as, in its early days, on the left one here, around late 19th century. And then I realized that for the first time on the Google Maps, that the church was built in the shape of a Latin cross. So that was a huge surprise to me. I was there for so long, for so many years. Never did I realize that it was constructed in that particular style. So which, of course, is very common among the Gothic churches around the world. I just did not realize that. In my early days at Raimondi College, every morning we would recite Hail Mary and the Lord's Prayer in classical Chinese. Okay, so classical Chinese. To this day, I can still recite those prayers more fluently than Buddhist scriptures. We had Bible classes, we studied parables, we attended Mass, we sang Catholic hymns. But maybe it was because I was still very young at the time. Religion to me felt more like another school subject, in addition to math, geography, history, and so on. So I was never really too interested in religion at the time. And yet, looking back, those early years quietly laid a foundation for me, a seed planted deep within me. They taught me to find meaning through sacred texts, through prayer, through ritual, and perhaps most importantly, through silence and contemplation. Okay, so very different from a mind of a boy who thought himself was a science student. So my journey toward Buddhism began much later. after my family immigrated to Toronto. Okay? And that also tells you something about the multicultural policy of Canada. Okay? It is in Canada that we allowed the flourishing and the development of many different religions on this soil. And it was only here that I discovered this Asian religion, Buddhism in all its diversity. So the next slide will show you how Buddhism is being practiced differently in different parts of the world. The yellow part, well, I should say maybe the first part, it's the dark red in the bottom. That's the so-called Theravada Buddhism. It's a Southeast Asian form of Buddhism. On the right, the yellow part, in East Asia, there is the Mahayana form. And then the orange part is known as Vajrayana. In places like Tibet, Mongolia, they are practicing the more tantric form of Buddhism. So I began my journey of Buddhism in the Chinese, the Chinese practice, and then moved on to Vajrayana, which I found to be more systematic. And then in recent years, I've also been studying Theravada teachings. And interestingly though, as I joined the faculty of Emmanuel College, the next slide, which is rooted in the ecumenical heritage of the United Church of Canada, I found myself revisiting the Christian teachings of my youth. Although different from the Catholicism I experienced in Hong Kong, my time at Emmanuel has been spiritually transformative, both academically and personally. Even though this is only my 5th year, but I'm forever indebted to this experience, which really opened my eyes in different ways. So what I'm sharing with you today is partly a reflection of my own spiritual journey. It is about how the faith I grew up with, the faith I embraced later in life, and the faith I now encounter daily through my work continue to shape and inspire myself. Okay? I would like to begin today by sharing something I learned very recently, very recently, just 2 weeks ago. The next slide. During the Toronto School of Theology's ecumenical service. That's Knox College at the U of T. Our guest preacher that day was Reverend Dr. Pablo Kim's son. I don't know if John has met him, but Reverend's son was serving as the intercultural liaison for the Presbyterian Church in Canada. If you are interested, the service is available on YouTube. I left the link there, but I can share the link with you later as well. At the start of his sermon, Reverend Sun described his remarkable faith journey within Christianity, a journey that took him from a Korean Presbyterian church to a Baptist seminary, then to a Jesuit school in Boston, a Methodist church, and then his PhD studies at Emmanuel College, which is rooted in the United Church, of course, and then the Christian Reformed Church, and now full circle back to the Presbyterian Church in Canada. As he reflected on his journey, Reverend Sun observed something that resonated deeply with me. He said, and I quote on the next slide, "Every denomination group, explicitly or implicitly, holds a belief that they have the right theology, the right way of being a faithful follower of Jesus, or the truest expression of Christianity." He described the ethos he encountered in various denominations. And sometimes the unspoken sense is that we've got it right, that our understanding is just a little more correct, a little more faithful than the others. As I listened to these words, I couldn't help but think, that feels all too familiar. You found exactly the same in Buddhism. The situation is exactly the same in Buddhism, if not more so. Every Buddhist tradition, down to individual temples within each school, often believes that they hold the deeper insight, if not the deepest insight, into the teachings and practices of the Buddha. I once read a Buddhist scholar who described these dynamics as, quote, polite rivalries. Polite rivalries. It's a fitting phrase, polite on the surface, but perhaps rivalries nonetheless. Okay, so there are not many collaborations among Buddhist temples. There is nothing like the Roman Catholic Church, which is the authority of all the Catholic churches in the world. There is no final authority in anything. So each one of the Buddhist temple would think of itself as being the truest, the most fitting recipient of the teachings of the Buddha. But then, isn't that simply a reflection of our human nature? Our desire to feel certain, to be secure in the belief that we are standing on the firmest ground. What I did not expect, and what truly stayed with me, was how Reverend Sun found his way through this maze of denominational certainty. So he described that as a two-stage process, and I'm going to share these two stages with you. First, he engaged in what he called deconstruction, using critical anti-racist, post-colonial and decolonial perspectives. He examined the theology of each denomination he encountered. He looked closely, not just at what was taught, but at what was assumed, scrutinizing traditions to uncover their limitations, their blind spots, their unexamined biases. That's the first stage. But he did not stop there. After the deconstruction, after shining a light on those limitations, he experienced something transformative. He began to see that alongside their flaws, each tradition holds unique gifts. Each offers its own wisdom, its own insight that enriches what he called epistemological humility. Now, that's a big term, epistemological humility, but its meaning is simple and powerful. The ability to recognize the limits of our knowledge, to remain open to the wisdom of others, even as we hold fast to our own convictions. Okay? So it's a balance between the two. You see the limitations, but you also see what is being offered, what is truly unique about the traditions that you are receiving.
Can you say that word again?
Epistemological humility. Humility, yes. Reverend Sun's words struck me as profoundly wise, not just for Christians, but for Buddhists as well. I found myself thinking, I wish more Buddhists could hear this. In a world where certainty often becomes a barrier, this kind of humility is not a weakness. It is a gift, a grace, a path to deeper understanding, not just of others, but of ourselves as well. As I continue reflecting on what Buddhists can learn from Christians, the first theme I would like to highlight is the spirit of ecumenism. So something that we began our gathering today with, about this ethos of the United Church, ecumenism. When I say this, I'm not suggesting that Buddhist scriptures are silent on these teachings. In fact, there is a profound example in one of the most beautiful texts in Buddhism. The next slide, please, which is titled the Ganda Vyuha Sutra. The text describes the spiritual journey of a seeker named Sudana, who embarks on a pilgrimage in search of enlightenment. And along the way, he studies under 53 spiritual friends. In Sanskrit, that's Kalyana Mitra, spiritual friends. And this famous story inspired many arts, throughout Asia. So this is one of the paintings of Sudana. What is remarkable is that, who were these spiritual friends? You may guess that, they may be Buddhist monastics, Buddhist masters, but not all of them were Buddhist practitioners. Among these 53 spiritual friends were also priests and practitioners, ascetic practitioners from other Indian religious traditions. There were also earth spirits, tree spirits. There were also wise elders. There were also a medical doctor, a sailor, a king, a queen, a prostitute, young boys and girls, and the list goes on. Very interesting in a way that it tells us that wisdom is not confined to a single group, a single tradition, or a single voice. Enlightenment, in the Buddhist view, can be nurtured through encounters with people from all walks of life, whether they are Buddhists or not, whether they are religious or not, whether they are ordained or lay practitioners, whether they are older or younger, okay? And whether they are even religious teachings at all. I think especially in later Zen Buddhism, the inspirations can come from everyday life, in arts, in paintings, in music, in archery, in all forms of life, in tea ceremony, and so on. So you may ask, if this teaching is already present in Buddhism, why am I suggesting that Buddhists need to learn it from Christians? The answer lies partly in the gap between theory and practice, between what is written in the sacred texts and how we live those teachings in our daily lives. While Buddhism emphasizes non-attachment and teaches that arrogance is a source of spiritual defilements, the reality is that many Buddhist schools and temples still fall into the same human tendency. Reverend Sun described so clearly, a situation that you will find in modern day Buddhist temples and in Buddhism throughout everywhere for thousands of years. They see themselves as the sole holders of the highest teachings of the Buddha, as if they alone possess the secret to perfect enlightenment. This is where the Christian tradition, especially through its ecumenical efforts, offers a powerful example. So Reverend Sun reminded us in his preaching, and I quote again, I don't have this on the slide, he said, quote, "Truth is always partially shaped by our historical, cultural, and theological context. And no single tradition, denomination, or theological framework has a complete grasp of divine truth," end quote. What we can learn from his experience is the humility to move beyond dogmatism and the willingness to be transformed through encounters with other traditions, cultures, and experiences. Interestingly, this very lesson is embedded in the story of Sudana that we just read. Yet the challenge is not in the scripture. The challenge is in living that wisdom authentically. So what do Buddhists need to learn from Christians? Not the doctrine itself, but the practice, the lived experience of engaging with others in openness, humility, and respect. We need more openness in how we approach not just other religious traditions, but even other Buddhist schools. We need more humility when reflecting on our own theological frameworks, recognizing that no one tradition holds all the answers. As I continue reflecting, the next slide, please, reflecting on what Buddhists can learn from Christians, I'd like to focus on a theme that we have already touched on many times, the word that I repeated many times, and that is humility. But I would like to explore it in a little deeper. In Buddhism, humility is often understood as the antidote to pride. It's the opposite of pride. Pride in thinking too highly of oneself, believing we are someone special or somehow exempt from the same rules that apply to others. It is traditionally seen as a personal quality directed towards individual spiritual training rather than towards a tradition or a school on the whole. One of the most celebrated works in the Buddhist tradition is the next slide, the Bodhisattva Charyavatara, or the Way of the Bodhisattva, which was written in the 7th century by an Indian master whose name was Shantideva. And he gave these words. Let me read that out for you very quickly. Self-confidence should be applied to wholesome actions, the overcoming of disturbing conceptions, and my ability to do this. Thinking, I alone shall do it, is the self-confidence of action. Powerless, their minds disturbed, people in this world are unable to benefit themselves. Therefore, I shall do it for them. Since, unlike me, these beings are incapable. Even if others are doing inferior tasks, why should I sit here doing nothing? I do not do these tasks because of self-importance. It would be best for me to have no such pride. When crows encounter a dying snake, they will act as though they were eagles. Likewise, if my confidence is weak, I shall be injured by the slightest downfall, end quote. So the language may be a little strange to you, the way that it is being written up. But what Shantideva speaks to here is the balance between confidence and humility, avoiding both arrogance and self-doubt. Interestingly, I see a parallel to something Reverend Sun shared in his sermon. The ability to recognize the limitation of one's own tradition, and that's avoiding arrogance. But while also maintaining confidence in the unique contributions of the tradition you are practicing, and that's avoiding self-doubt. And it is here that I find truly remarkable that the way Christianity has elevated humility to something transformative, not just for individual practice, but for entire communities and traditions. So if you look at this is more for the practitioners to not hold on to the pride when serving other sentient beings. But what I find in Christianity is that the humility extends towards the communities and traditions. In Christianity, humility isn't just a personal virtue. It is the foundation upon which ecumenism is built. So you are seeing that I'm trying to connect the concept of ecumenism and humility. It is the very quality that makes space for dialogue, for collaboration, and for the beautiful diversity we see within the Christian world today. The United Church of Canada is a shining example of this. Its ecumenical spirit isn't just a theoretical ideal, it is lived out in practice through partnerships, shared openness to learning from different Christian traditions and beyond. So now if we turn to Buddhism, the story is quite different. Historically, if we turn to the next slide, Buddhism has not had a formal practice of ecumenism. There is one notable exception, which is the Rimé movement in the 19th century Tibet. The movement emerged as a response to the growing dominance of a school known as the Gelug school, which is the tradition associated with all the Dalai Lamas in the past. But that school had become politically too powerful. So other Tibetan Buddhist traditions, named here, such as the Nyingma, the Kagyu, the Sakya, they gathered together as an effort to preserve the richness and diversity of Tibetan Buddhism. It wasn't about blending traditions into one, but rather about respecting and reviving the distinctive teachings of each. The movement thrived from around 1850s to 1890s, so around 40 years at its peak, but its influence waned in the 20th century as it was overshadowed by the political turmoil and the devastating impact of the Chinese Cultural Revolution in the 1950s. So, to put it simply, ecumenism in Buddhism is rare, very rare. And this brings me to a personal reflection. The next slide about Emmanuel College, where I teach, where I see something extraordinary. The next slide, please. So Emmanuel, deeply rooted in his Christian heritage, doesn't just offer programs in Christian theology. It also offers Muslim and Buddhist streams within its Master of Spiritual Studies. Okay? And also, there are other certificate programs as well. And there are also the Muslim and Buddhist streams in our Master of Theological Studies program. We have PhD students pursuing Buddhist studies. The next slide, please. So there is the hybrid MDiv program, something that we began to develop over the last year or so. And then the following slide. The MTS, Master of Theological Studies, which is also available in different faith foci. And then the following slide. There is also our Master of Sacred Music program. So we are thinking about the possibility of developing a Buddhist stream in this Master of Sacred Music program. If successful, if we are able to launch that program, that will be the very first in history of this world. And the next slide. Yeah, so if you are interested, there's the, how do you call that, the QR code there. The question that came to my mind as I was looking at these slides was that, can I imagine a Buddhist university offering a theological program dedicated to training Christian or Muslim ministries or chaplains? Well, honestly, I haven't seen that yet. There may be interreligious dialogues programs. There may be programs on philosophy. There may be programs on religious studies or even fine arts, of the East and West and so on. But full programs dedicated to pastoral formation of leaders from other faith traditions, well, not yet. That speaks to us something about this openness, these great minds of the United Church. This is where the Christian example shines. It shows us what is possible when humility isn't just a personal virtue, but a guiding principle for institutions and communities. So today, let me leave you this thought. What if humility wasn't just about how we see ourselves, but about how our traditions see each other? What new possibilities could that create? Not just for dialogue, so we saw pictures of interreligious dialogues, but it's not just for dialogues, but for genuine transformation. We can transform ourselves spiritually through encounter with other religions. The idea of openness and critical reflection is not absent in Buddhism. So having criticized my own tradition in different ways, I should also say that that kind of teaching is not completely absent. In fact, one of the most striking examples comes from the Kalama Sutta, the following slide. I won't read it out all for you, but it is a Buddhist scripture that stands as a testament against fanaticism, bigotry, dogmatism, and intolerance. So I won't read this out, but the story begins with the people of a place known as Kalama, who approached the Buddha with a dilemma that sounds maybe all too familiar to all of us today. They were confused because so many ascetics, sages, venerables, practitioners, the holy ones of different traditions, different religions, had passed through their town, each proclaiming their version of the truth. Their teachings often contradicted one another, leaving the people bewildered and uncertain. So they were asking what the Buddha thought about these other teachings and what the Buddha thought about his own teaching. And in response, the Buddha offered guidance that remains profoundly relevant to all of us today. He said, "Do not believe anything on mere hearsay. Do not believe in traditions merely because they are old and have been handed down for many generations. Do not believe anything on account of rumors or because people talk a great deal about it. Do not believe anything because you are shown the written testimony of some ancient sage. Do not believe in what you have fancied, thinking that because it is extraordinary, it must have been inspired by God or other wonderful being. Do not believe anything merely because presumption is in its favor or because the custom of many years inclines you to take it as true. Do not believe anything merely on the authority of your teachers or priests." And then he offered this powerful conclusion. "But whatever, after thorough investigation and reflection, you find to agree with reason and experience as conducive to the good and benefit of one and all and of the world at large, accept only that as true and shape your life in accordance with it." It doesn't mention which religious teachings. It doesn't mention even his own teaching, but whatever that you can find to be in agreement. After your thorough investigation and reflection, after seeing that the teachings are conducive to the good and benefit not only for yourself, but also for other people in the world at large, only then take that as the guiding principles. What is remarkable is that the Buddha did not exempt his own teachings from this scrutiny. He said very clearly that do not accept any doctrine from reverence, But first, try it as good as gold is tried by fire. So try it out. See if that works. This is not just a lesson in discernment. It is an invitation to approach spiritual life with both critical inquiry and open-minded humility. Because we all have biases, we carry them towards our own traditions, and we carry them when we encounter others. We are carrying the biases within us. But ultimately, the spiritual truth or reality we seek is something that transcends any theological framework we construct. So, shall we take a short break here before we continue to the... Sure. Any questions that I can help answer? I'm seeing maybe some movement that you might need to use a washroom or something. But I'm happy to address any questions that you may have. I talked about humility. I talked about ecumenism. We are going into a kind of another topic after the short break, but I'm happy to answer any questions. Yes, please.
Yeah, sorry, because there's people online and they want to hear the question.
In the matter of involvement with the world, I guess Christianity and Buddhism would appear to have taken somewhat different approaches. Mm-hmm. And maybe that was just circumstance, but can you just comment on that?
I think partly it is because Buddhism began as an ascetic tradition. Okay, so you may have in your mind a classic kind of image about the Buddhist monks living alone in the forest, wandering around, not having any interest in the world affairs. They try to find their own enlightenment, detach themselves from the world entirely. But Christians are taking a different approach to that. So I think this is how we see the differences. But as I'll continue to talk, after the break, there is a new form of Buddhism developed in the 20th century known as engaged Buddhism. So that takes us back to a very different direction: how to be socially engaged, so that we can share our compassion and love and wisdom for others. And therefore, Christianity and Buddhism can be seen as developing towards the same direction that way. Thank you. Hi.
Hello, my name's Sarah Arthurs,
Sarah,
and
yes,
I'm
yeah.
the Executive Director of the Calgary Interfaith Council. So I'm listening to you very deeply and have
Thank
way
you.
too many questions. But the first comment I would make would be I was planning to come to this, and then I looked at the title of the lecture more closely, and I thought, oh my goodness, I was completely expecting, what Buddhism can offer to Christianity. So I was like, what's he going to say? I was so intrigued. So I'm really enjoying what you have to offer. I guess my specific question is, I'm really curious on your reflections about, which it sounds like you're going to move into, about how Buddhism has changed, since Buddhists came to North America,
Right.
with what happened in China and the
Right.
whole kind of, evolution that's happening in that tradition with Western practitioners and Western leaders. And yes, so I'm really curious about that.
Well,
Anyway,
thank you for the question. There are already many changes taking place before Buddhism was introduced to North America. So an example is what I mentioned earlier about engaged Buddhism. So that began, I'll have a slide on that, during the Vietnam War. When Thich Nhat Hanh was in the midst of the war, he was sitting inside the meditation hall, listening to the bombings outside, people screaming and people getting hurt. And he was asking himself, should I continue to find my own enlightenment within this meditation hall? Or should I go out and help those people, whoever got injured, whether they came from the northern Vietnam or southern Vietnam. So he taught the latter. He went out, he actually formed this movement that engaged his followers, to practice Buddhism in such a way. So that would be one of the many changes that already took place before Buddhism was introduced to North America. But there are additional changes in North America. Some scholars would divide Buddhism in North America into two forms: Western Buddhism and Asian Buddhism. And when they said so, I think it's a polemic voice suggesting that the so-called Western Buddhism is superior than Asian Buddhism because Asian Buddhists are so used to practicing all kinds of rituals. They are not as interested in people in the West in doing mindfulness meditation or reading the Buddhist texts, engaging themselves in philosophical kind of debates or reflections. They practice their Buddhism through rituals and chantings and prostrations and all that. So in the eyes of the Western Buddhists, the Asian Buddhists are superstitious. They never really understand what the Buddha taught. So, which I don't agree. It's a very different approach to spiritual learning. It's not cognitive. It is not through intellectual kind of understanding, but rather it is through immersing yourself, completely into the practice, so that when you are doing the chanting, when you are engaged in the rituals, you are technically also practicing quote unquote meditation. So meditation is not limited to the moment when you are sitting in silent, cross-legged. It's not that. Meditation, in my own experience, is nothing other than kind of mental exercise, kind of mental training. So you go to the gym to work out and develop your muscles, but you can also develop your mental muscles, your spiritual muscles through meditation. And that can be done anytime, even when I'm standing here. Technically, I can be meditating, being mindful of where I am, being mindful of all these teachings that we mentioned about humility, about respect of other traditions and all that. And if I'm able to engage my mind in such a way, that is already a kind of meditation. So that is another example of how Buddhism has changed in the West. Did that answer your question? Okay, thank you. Yeah.
Okay, we're going to the people online, we'll take about a 10-minute break, and if you have any questions online, please type them in and we'll make sure we get them, but we'll give you a chance to move and stretch. There's washrooms to my left at the front or down these halls to the right, coffee and goodies at the back, so take about a 10-minute break if that's okay. Thank you.
So thank you.
Okay, I'll invite you back. Henry will continue on. And I've just mentioned people online, there's 20 people who are various places in the world who are with us in spirit and online. If you have questions for us, please type them in. We'll take note of them. I'll invite Henry to reappear from behind the wall. And thanks again to Nancy and Elaine. I think they were the main hostesses today. What great food. Thank you.
So we'll address the question. Right. Well, welcome back. And I'm so glad that you haven't left. But thank you for being here. Let me continue. At the heart of Buddhist practice is what we call taking refuge in the three jewels. Or sometimes they call that the triple gems, the three jewels. And that's the Buddha, the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. The Buddha represents the enlightened person, the enlightened one, the person who embodied awakening. That's the historical Buddha. The Dharma is the Buddha's teachings, the path that guides us towards wisdom and compassion. And the Sangha, all of these are Indian words. The Sangha is a spiritual community, the fellowship of practitioners who walk the path together. So there is the monastic community, especially that, sometimes the Sangha is referred specifically to the monastic Sangha. Well, the question is, after our earlier discussions before the break, what happens when we view these three jewels through an ecumenical lens? So we talked about how Buddhists should learn ecumenism from Christians. So what if we start viewing these fundamental beliefs of the Buddhists through such an ecumenical lens? Well, the Buddha need not be limited to the historical figure or the founder of the tradition known to us as Buddhism. Perhaps Buddha can represent any being across traditions who have embodied wisdom, compassion, and truth. Okay? So anyone who has awakened to this spiritual potential to become fully embodied in wisdom and compassion and truth. And similarly, the Dharma does not have to be confined to the Buddhist scriptures alone. It can encompass any wisdom that leads us towards understanding, love, and liberation, whether found in sacred scriptures, the words of the Bible, the words of the Christian mystics, or the quiet insights of someone we meet in everyday life, or even in music, in arts, whatever that inspires us deeply in our search for wisdom and compassion. That's the Dharma. And the Sangha, the community, is not just the Buddhist monastic or lay assembly. It can include congregations like this one, communities of faith and practice from all religious traditions, united by a shared search for truth and meaning. And here is something interesting. While Buddhism holds space for this kind of expansive view, the formal practice of ecumenism, the active, organized effort to foster unity across different schools, different traditions, is rare. Something I also mentioned earlier. Even more intriguing is that Buddhism does not have an exact equivalent for the term humility. In Indian language, in Chinese language, in Japanese or Korean languages, well, there is no such a vocabulary. as humility as it is understood in Christianity? Well, in modern Chinese, modern Japanese, of course, we have the new modern translation of humility. But before we have the translation of the Christian texts, such a term did not exist. In Buddhist texts, we find concepts related to modesty, self-restraint, or the absence of pride, but the rich relational dimension of humility, that deep sense of reverence and openness, not just before the divine, but in our encounters with one another, is uniquely emphasized in Christianity. And perhaps this is one of the most profound lessons Buddhists can learn from Christians, that humility is not just a personal virtue, but a doorway to genuine dialogue, to transmission, and to the kind of ecumenical spirit that doesn't just tolerate difference, but celebrates it as part of the beautiful, diverse expression of the sacred in our world. The next slide, please. So we talked about the fact that the vocabulary cannot be found in the Asian language. So the question is, what's in a name? That familiar phrase comes from Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet. So it goes like this. What's in a name that which we call a rose by any other name would smell as sweet? The words reminds us that names are in essence just labels. They don't alter the fundamental nature of things. A rose, after all, would retain its fragrance and beauty no matter what we called it. The idea is simple yet profound. What truly matters is the substance, not the label. And yet, even though I agree perfectly with this, and yet, sometimes a name can do more than just identify. Sometimes a name carries the power to shape perceptions, inspire action, and even transform reality. Take, for example, the buzz around artificial intelligence these days, especially with large language models like ChatGPT or, more recently, DeepSeek. The next slide. Well, I mentioned that I considered myself a science student, but I'm no computer expert. I don't claim to understand the complex algorithms behind these systems. But from my own experience as a user, I have observed something fascinating, and which is, in order to get meaningful results from an AI system such as ChatGPT, you need to provide prompts. You need to ask the proper questions. A prompt is essentially a conversation starter. It is how you guide the artificial intelligence to generate a specific response. The art of crafting these inputs has even become a specialized field known as prompt engineering. It is all about selecting the right words, phrases, and formats to produce the most useful outcome. In other words, the way you frame the prompt directly influences the result you get. Here is where it gets interesting, that our human intelligence is not all that different. We too respond to prompts, whether they come from questions, ideas, experiences, or quite often from names, from phrases, from vocabularies. Names are more than labels. They are prompts that shape how we think, how we feel, how we engage with the world around us. So, to arrive at a mini conclusion to this part of my presentation. Buddhism needs the names humility and ecumenism as a driving force. Yes? Tim, right? Yeah, hi. Does Tim need a microphone for the online?
I can talk loud. Okay. I'll just talk loud.
Okay.
I'm wondering if humility falls within the context of Buddhist teachings of the middle way.
Mm-hmm.
The middle way has concepts of saying, by my understanding, that it is a way of being able to look and to recognize that both
Right.
good and bad, hot and cold,
Yes.
etc.,
Yes. Yes.
all exist.
Yes.
However, by looking at it with a middle lens,
Mm-hmm.
then that gives us the opportunity to do it with humility.
Yeah. Yes. Exactly. Well, remember the question is about whether humility in the context of Buddhism can be understood through the Buddhist teachings of the middle way. And I think that is exactly what we read about earlier in the work of Shantideva. When I mentioned the balance between avoiding arrogance and avoiding self-doubt, but to have the pride in what we are doing and the confidence in what we are doing without holding on to the pride as if we are superior to others, that is a kind of middle way in Buddhism. And that too is a Buddhist kind of implicit teaching about humility. And yet, the word humility is not emphasized. And what I try to share with you is the notion that sometimes we need to highlight on a name so that it provides us with a driving force behind our spiritual practice. So that's why I said Buddhism needs the names humility and ecumenism. Thank you, Tim. Having a name for something creates a space for that to exist, to grow, and I think more importantly, to be nurtured. It's not just an idea, but we have to nurture that. We have to cultivate what is behind the name. Without a name, the concept remains abstract, unformed, and often overlooked. But once we name it, we give it life, we give it purpose. Ecumenism is more than just a term. It is therefore also a prompt, just like ChatGPT. We are artificially human intelligence in this way. It invites us to move beyond the boundaries of our traditions, to engage in meaningful dialogue, to practice mutual understanding, and to build bridges across spiritual communities. While Buddhism contains teachings that encourages openness, critical reflection, and respect for diverse paths, as seen in the earlier text I quote, the Kalama Sutta, it has rarely formalized these principles into something as intentional and structured as Christian ecumenism. So what if we did? What if the Buddhists embraced the word, the teaching, and the cultivation of this? Well, it would not be just occasional dialogue that you will find the Dalai Lama would have, this meeting with Desmond Tutu and so on, but rather as an ongoing practice. It's not just a show to put on stage that a Buddhist is now having conversation with a Muslim leader or a Christian leader, but an ongoing practice. What if we created spaces where the wisdom of different Buddhist schools can be shared freely, not in the spirit of polite rivalry, I mentioned earlier, but in genuine collaboration? So I said that the situation in Buddhism may be even worse than, I think many united churches can work together, but the Buddhist temples are in many ways polite rivalries. And beyond that, what if we extended that spirit into our relationships with other faiths? Christianity, Islam, Hinduism, and more, acknowledging that truth, beauty, and insight are not confined to any one tradition. So maybe the name ecumenism is not just found in Christianity. It is rather a word that belongs to all of us, a prompt that invites every tradition to grow, to connect, and to be transformed. So names matter. They help us recognize what is possible. They guide us toward what could be. So that's one part of my presentation today. And as we build upon this conversation on names, on labels, I would like to reflect on another concept that, once again, don't have a concept that doesn't have exact equivalence in the Buddhist context. So next slide, and that's the concept of justice. You won't find this vocabulary in the Asian languages before translation was available. So therefore, you won't find that in the context of a Buddhist text that focus and emphasize on the discussion of justice. You might find it surprising that in a vast expanse of the Buddhist texts, teachings, and traditions, whether in India, Tibet, or Chinese languages, there is this absence of a specific term that we would consider to be fundamental in our spiritual practice, in the formation of our personality and all that. But this absence of a specific term does not mean that the Buddha turned a blind eye to injustice. Far from it. So consider the context in which the Buddha lived. Ancient India, 2,600 years ago, where the caste system had been deeply entrenched for thousands of years. That system rigidly divided society into hierarchical classes, with one's social status determined entirely by birth. So you were being born into one of these classes, and that for the rest of your life, you cannot imagine climbing up the social ladder to become a member of a higher class. You cannot marry someone from a higher class, so you just remain in your class until you die. People were bound to the class they were born into, and there is no possibility of the kind of mobility I mentioned. The system was often justified through a distorted understanding of karma, suggesting that one's social position was a result of past actions in previous lives. So you can imagine the Indians at the time were saying that it is only fair that I'm repaying the debts that I owed in my previous life. So, but here is where the Buddha's teachings were radical for their time. Within his own Sangha, the Buddha's monastic community, these divisions were dismantled. So everyone within the Buddhist Sangha were considered equal. Yes?
What was the original intent of the caste system by the laws of Manu? I'm not sure who organized it, Krishna or someone else. What was the intent when it began? How did it become corrupted?
Right. It's a big question. The question is, what was the intention behind the caste system? Well, I think that can be approached in different perspectives. But one of the ways that we can understand it is that the caste system was considered to be part of the sacred teachings of a bunch of sacred texts at the time known as the Vedas. Only the priests would have full access to the teachings of the Vedas. And it was also the priests who told the public that in the sacred teachings of the Vedas, the society, different humankinds should be divided into these different classes, with the priests occupying the highest class. So, in other words, it is also a way to secure their own privilege. They even see themselves as superior to the kings and the warriors. Okay, so that's the second class. And then the third class would be the merchants. The fourth class, the servants and slaves. Okay? So they also have ideas about how there was an ancient giant known, the name was Purusha, who was who existed at the beginning of our world, but he sacrificed his body so that different parts of his body became different parts of our world. The two eyes became the sun and moon and all that. But there was also the understanding that the upper class, the priestly class, came from the head. The kings and the warriors came from the two arms. The merchants came from the chunk of the body, and then the slaves and the servants came from the legs. So it kind of reflects how they conceived the sense of purity that way. And I think the intention partly was to secure the privileges of the priests at the time. And they also have the belief that this is how the universe should be running. If you disrupt this order, you will bring chaos to our world. So if there are natural disasters, earthquakes and floods and whatnot going on, it's an indication that someone does not behave according to the caste system. So, people at the time were very, very bound by that set of belief. Okay, so for a very long time, and even nowadays, the caste system, has existed for thousands of years, as I said. But the Buddha tried to do away that kind of distinction, that kind of discrimination within his own spiritual community, so that everyone was welcomed as equals. And in that space, a former prince, the Buddha, could sit side by side with a former slave, not defined by their past, but united by their shared commitment to the path of awakening. So, is that a sense of justice? Yes or no? Not exactly, but you could see that the Buddha tried to see everyone as equal that way. In Christianity, justice is not merely about cosmic balance or consequences. It is deeply personal, relational, and rooted in the very character of God. Christians believe that God is perfectly just, fair, righteous, and impartial in all his actions. In the New Testament, we see justice embodied in Jesus, who not only spoke of justice, but lived justice, lived it through acts of mercy and forgiveness. So justice in a Christian tradition is not passive, once again. It is active. Christians are called to do justice, to stand with the oppressed, to advocate for the marginalized, and to act with integrity. It is more than just fairness. It is about compassion in action, rooted in the conviction that every human being bears the image of God. This is also where courage comes in. Another word that you may not find explained in the same way in the Buddhist tradition. So the next slide, courage. So this is a remarkable teaching, preaching, that I find so much courage in the words of the Right Reverend Marian Edgar Buddy very recently. Well, this is where courage shines, because standing up for justice often requires more than good intentions. It requires bravery, the courage to confront systems of oppression, to speak out when it is uncomfortable, to risk one's own safety or status for the sake of others. I'm seeing all this in the bishop here. The sense of justice intertwined with courage has given rise to powerful movements within Christianity, which calls on people of faith to actively resist injustice and work towards transformation, social transformation. So this is not something that I am seeing a lot from among the Buddhists. I'm not saying that they are completely absent, but not a lot. And I would see more of these kinds of Buddhists. And I got a question earlier about this lack of social engagement by the Buddhists. And I think some of that was also due to the Buddhist understanding of suffering in a very different way from the Christians. Traditional interpretations and practices of Buddhism have long focused on the alleviation of suffering from the cycle of birth, death, and rebirth, something that they called the samsara. It is suffering, it is the liberation from samsara altogether. You know, when we use the word liberation, I think very naturally we may want to ask, liberation from what? Well, liberation from suffering. You also get that from the Christian neighbors, the Christian practitioners. But the core of the Buddhist teachings would emphasize that it is the liberation of the samsaric suffering altogether. The core of Buddhist teachings, particularly in early texts, emphasizes this existential suffering, the deep underlying dissatisfaction that comes from the impermanence of life, the inevitability of loss, and the continuous craving that binds us to the cycle of samsara. In this framework, liberation is understood as the ultimate freedom from this cycle. It is the cessation of suffering at its very root, the extinguishing of the fires of greed, hatred, and delusion that keep us trapped in the endless rounds of rebirth. This is a profound and transformative goal, one that speaks to the deepest dimensions of human experience. So nothing about that is wrong or improper. But in addressing our human suffering from that perspective, the challenge is that this focus on existential liberation has at times created a kind of blind spot when it comes to addressing more immediate, mundane forms of suffering. So things like systemic oppression, economic inequality, racial injustice, and political violence. You don't hear Buddhists talk about those a lot. The emphasis on personal enlightenment and inner peace, while they are invaluable, can sometimes overshadow the need to engage with a very real, very urgent suffering that people face in their daily lives. So this is where I also believe Buddhism can be enriched by learning from Christianity. In the Christian tradition, salvation is not solely about the afterlife. It is also about the here and now. Jesus' ministry was not limited to teaching about heaven. It was deeply rooted in the acts of love, healing, and justice within the social and political realities of his time. He reached out to the marginalized He spoke truth to power and he challenged systems of oppression. His message was as much about restoring dignity and justice in this world as it was about preparing for the next. So, this holistic vision of salvation, one that integrates personal transformation with social justice, has inspired movements like liberation theology, which emerged in the 20th century. Liberation theology boldly asserts that faith without action is incomplete. It calls for a preferential option for the poor, advocating for the oppressed and standing in solidarity with those who suffer under unjust systems. So the next slide, a comparative theologian, Dean William Firm, concludes his study of third world liberation theology is that one of the salient features of Christian liberation theology is that it stresses liberation from all forms of human oppression, social, economic, political, racial, sexual, environmental, religious. Okay, I think that is very beautifully put. Well, I mentioned engaged Buddhism. So something like this is not completely absent in Buddhism. But the development was very late, I would say, only beginning in the latter half of the 20th century. A movement emerged within Buddhism that speaks not only to the heart of transformational, personal transformation, but also to healing of the world. This is what I mentioned earlier as socially engaged Buddhism. Next slide, please. So these are the leaders, or I should say some of the leaders of engaged Buddhism in Asian countries. You see the Dalai Lama on the top right, and then the top right bottom is Thich Nhat Hanh. Okay? And in between them is Dr. Ambedkar of Sri Lanka. He emphasized about how he could help with the post-colonial economic situation of Sri Lanka. So instead of having Sri Lanka government relying on the support from foreign countries, they had to find a way to support themselves. So he taught the villagers to develop their own village industries. So each village focused on something that they could do best, and they share those resources with a neighboring village, something that continues like this so that even though they are not making themselves millionaires, they can sustain their own lives without relying on financial aids or some foreign supports. But all of these are inspired by the Buddhist teachings, so that's something truly, truly significant in the history of Sri Lanka, in the recent history of Sri Lanka. And then in the middle, in the central picture, the upper one is Bhikkhu Buddhadasa, a monk in Thailand. And then on his left is Venerable Tai Hsu in China, 19th century China, who was having a mission to revitalize the practice of Buddhism in China at a time when Buddhism was perceived nothing more than a bunch of funeral rites. So people only visited the Buddhist temples when there was a death in the family. And they never read Buddhist texts, they never practiced Buddhism. So he began to see the value of incorporating the Buddhist wisdom into daily lives. And that, under him, he trained a few monastics who became very, very influential in Taiwan. So they are, the founders of Buddhist communities like the Fo Guangshan, which means Buddhist Light Mountain, the Fagoshan, the Dharmadrum Mountain, and others. Each one of these institutions have millions of followers, and they are doing a lot, not only for the Taiwanese people, but also in different parts of the world. And then on the far left is Mr. Ikeda of Soka Gakkai International. So a way that Soka Gakkai, the Japanese form of Buddhism, could incorporate arts, environmental issues into the Buddhist practice. And then there is also on his right, Dr. Ambedkar of India, B.R. Ambedkar, who single-handedly in the 1950s, we can move on to the next slide. There's a description of Dr. Ambedkar, who led 500,000 of India's untouchable community, seeking liberation from systemic injustice by way of mass conversion to Buddhism. So what happened was that, Dr. Ambedkar himself was a member of the so-called Dalit community, which are the lowest, the grassroots, the lowest people in the caste system. So they are even worse than slaves. They are being treated very unequally, very unjustly. They cannot visit the barber shops. They cannot have access to the same well for water, and they could not attend the same school as other children. So what Ambedkar realized was that among all the problems of the caste system, the root of that is that it is part of the Hindu faith. Okay? And that the only way that he could let these people, he compared himself to Moses, actually. He was also a student of the Bible. So in order to liberate these people, they had to denounce their association with Hinduism. And they need to find a religion to convert to. And therefore, he led 500,000 of the Dalit community members in the 1950s to convert to Buddhism. Okay, so, all of these are, question, yes.
Just wondering, historically, how did the Buddha come to separate himself from Hinduism?
Well, the question is, how did the Buddha come to separate himself from Hinduism? Well, I cannot answer the question with certainty. I can imagine that the Buddha and his community was considered as heretics at that time. So there was the Orthodox religion that we now call as Hinduism. And Buddhism, along with many other religions at the time, they were practicing in the rural area, in the forests. It wasn't a major religion to begin with. Okay? So they only declared that they lost faith in the Orthodox tradition. They saw all kinds of what's the word for that? Corruptions among the Vedic priests. Okay? They saw how the system is unjust, therefore they try to find a different spiritual path to attain what they call liberation from samsara. Okay? So that's how Buddhism began. I don't even think the Buddhism was intended to develop his tradition into a quote-unquote major world religion. Okay, so he only left what is available to his disciples so that they could also attain the same level of realization. Okay? So this movement, known as socially engaged Buddhism, is founded on a profound truth that the path to world peace is inseparable to the path to inner peace, and vice versa. Okay? So therefore, nonviolence is the key to many of these movements. The Dalai Lama received the Nobel Peace Prize because of his insistence that whatever demonstrations against the Chinese taking over Tibet, that has to be done in a nonviolent way. That's the only means he could accept. Okay? Buddhists believe in causality, causes and results. And the Dalai Lama also emphasized that only with a peaceful means that you'll be able to get a peaceful result. Okay? The end never justifies the means. So you can never, have a very wonderful imagination of what the ends, the outcome would be, and then you are doing all kinds of violent means in order to achieve that. Okay? So inner peace and world peace, they are interrelated that way. And they are also deeply rooted in the notion of nonviolence, not merely as an ideal, but as an essential means through which genuine social, economic, and political change can be achieved. So socially engaged Buddhism is a response to the deep suffering experienced by ordinary people, mundane suffering experienced by ordinary people. It has often inspired reform, modernization, and a rethinking of ancient teachings to meet the spiritual needs of our times. It reminds us that compassion is not confined to meditation halls or sacred texts. It must live and breathe in our actions, our communities, and our pursuit of justice. It has to be found in social engagement. Okay? So examples of this is that, for example, there are fundamental precepts in Buddhism. There are 5 fundamental precepts. The first one is not to kill. Second, not to steal. And then not to lie or false speech, not to have false speech. Not to have sexual misconduct. And the last one is not to be intoxicated, not to get drunk, that kind of avoidance. Okay? So some of these thinkers in engaged Buddhism, for example, Shulak Shuvaraksha in Thailand, they were famous in their reinterpretation of these 5 precepts. Okay, so for example, not to kill is not just about being vegetarian. It is not just about, being very careful as you walk along, the Kensington area, not to step on an ant, not to kill other animals, accidentally. But what is important is not to allow our government to develop mass destructive weapons. Okay, so the scope is much, much bigger. It is not to kill is also related to the concept of nonviolence or ahimsa. Well, all this violence in the movies that we are seeing, we play a role in encouraging the filmmakers to make more movies like those. So we should not just blame whoever created the movies. We help created those. In the same way, we help encourage our governments in some ways to act in ways that are unjust, in ways that would cause systemic oppression in our society and all kinds of suffering we are seeing people around us. So we need to have the courage to speak up and to reinterpret the 5 precepts in a way that is not just about spiritual practice, how to make sure that I would not be reborn in samsara. It's more than that. So that not stealing is also about not having, not encouraging yourself or others for illegal downloading, for example, on the internet. Or not to waste our resources. That's also a steal. We have access to many resources in North America, but in our world, not many are as fortunate as us. Okay? So refrain from standing in the shower for like 20 minutes. Just let the water run and waste our resources. That too is a reminder of this precept of not stealing. Okay? And so on and so on. So, you can see how the flexibility of this reinterpretation of ancient classic teachings in ways that are more meaningful and relevant and applied in the modern society. The next slide, please. Interestingly, the term engaged Buddhism was not coined by Ambedkar in India, but by Thich Nhat Hanh during the years of the Vietnam War. I believe it was in 1966 or 67 that he coined the term engaged Buddhism. Thich Nhat Hanh called for a collective awakening, not just within individuals, but within entire communities. Thich Nhat Hanh recognized that the traditional focus on personal enlightenment needed to be expanded to address the suffering caused by war, the Vietnam War, poverty, and systemic injustice. Engaged Buddhism took the timeless principles of mindfulness and compassion and rooted them in real-world action, advocating for peace, environmental justice, and human rights. And I can imagine that part of those might have been borrowed or learned from Christian theology. Okay, so Thich Nhat Hanh was a student at Princeton University where he studied comparative religion. Okay? The other thinker I mentioned, Shulak Shivaraksha in Thailand, he too was also an academic, and he was also a pioneer in fostering interreligious dialogue back in the 1970s. Okay? And because of his criticism on the Thai government at the time, he was on exile for many years. And at one time, he was teaching at the University of Toronto as a visiting professor. So I'm sure they must have come across ideas from Christian theology and how they shape their movements through the inspiration that they received from Christian theology. It's something that I think will be interesting for academics to study. So what does all this mean for us today? It means that socially engaged Buddhism teaches us to see the connection between personal suffering and suffering woven into the fabric of society. True compassion cannot turn a blind eye to the wounds of the world. It calls us to confront not only the struggles within our own minds, but also the pain caused by poverty, homelessness, discrimination, violence, environmental degradation, and injustice in all its forms. So although Buddhism is known for being, well, quote unquote, compassionate, how do they express their compassion? I think this is a very good venue for Buddhists to actually apply their practice and share their compassions for others. And yet, as with all movements that seek to breathe new life into ancient traditions, socially engaged Buddhism also faces its critics. I'll come to you shortly. Some argue that socially engaged Buddhism strays too far from traditional teachings. So I mentioned the classic image of the Buddhists, being indifferent to the society. They try not to be tangled with all kinds of distractions in our society, but prefer to live a quiet, silent life in the forest. Well, some Buddhists would think that that is how Buddhism should be practiced, not the kind of socially engaged Buddhism I mentioned. So therefore, some would call socially engaged Buddhism heresy. This tension is part of the spiritual journey itself, I guess. The struggle to remain rooted in timeless truths while reaching out to heal the ever-changing world. It is in this endeavor that Christian liberation is particularly inspiring. And again, what Buddhists should learn from Christians. Yes.
I'm just wondering if there's a role for, I don't know if it's a role exactly, but say people meditating alone, separate from society, nevertheless raising the level of consciousness in the world, or at least contributing to it, but remaining physically separate. I mean, maybe there's some introverts want to do that, some extroverts want to get socially engaged.
Well, I don't know if there's a name for that, but what I can say is that with all these ideas around socially engaged Buddhism, I'm not saying, and neither did all these leaders were saying, that meditation is not important. Rather, remember I talked about inner peace and world peace? Inner peace is achieved through meditation. It is the source of our resilience. We can learn all these wonderful religious teachings intellectually, conceptually. But when it comes to the time of crisis, when it comes to the time when we are being challenged, we may not have the lived experience, the lived resilience to deal with the crisis. So we need to ground ourselves, to practice our spirituality so that we can translate that experience into actual, practical, compassionate use in our society. So I think engaged Buddhism is suggesting that there is a way that we can make use of our daily meditation for the greater goodness of other humankind. And not only humankind, but also they are interested in endeavors like environmental protections, so other living beings in the forests, for example. So the concept is interrelatedness. A species that are completely unknown to us, that we haven't even heard of the name of the species, might be related deeply to our survivals, to the way we live our lives.
Henry, I wonder if you just said, do you have any comments for us as that relates back to true humility? Because I think that there's a risk that without that deep contemplation, or in the Buddhist tradition, meditation, activism can be very anger-driven, and that tension with humility can be quite fraught.
Right.
I wonder if you have any remarks for us on that.
Yeah, I think that is something that distinguishes comes to me, actually. Thank you. That may be a distinguished characteristic of socially engaged Buddhism that emphasizes nonviolence, non-greed, non-hatred as a foundation of all forms of activism. And it's not just in the ideas. There is the do's and don'ts, a list of do's and don'ts, and what we should not do is being angry. It's not that. It is a byproduct of meditation. So that the more we practice, the more we should be able to tap into this spiritual potential, this resilience, and so that we are naturally compassionate, loving, kind, and not angry. Okay, so we mentioned that we need names. We need names like humility, justice, and all that. But I can also see that for those who practice their meditation or whatever spiritual practices deeply, even without the names, they have those qualities developed within them. Okay? So for ordinary practitioners like me, sometimes I need the names to guide my practice. But there are also other, really enlightened, especially like spiritual beings who might have come to the realization of all these qualities without the need of having the names. Tim, yes? Yeah.
Fascinating that we're speaking about humility and you're also speaking about ChatGPT, all this kind of stuff.
Right.
I find both those concepts fascinating, and at the same time, you place the emphasis on the fact that naming something is beginning to understand it.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
So I've leaned into ChatGPT to create names for the things that I don't understand. So one of the concepts that I didn't fully understand in Buddhism is the concept of equanimity.
Mm-hmm.
Equanimity could kind of be looked at as a way of being able to kind of see things with equal power, I guess, not really having a
The mic is coming to you. I test.
Thank you, John.
Yeah.
Equanimity is this concept that I really couldn't understand after spending some time in Thailand studying Buddhism. But what I did is I came home and I looked into this word deeper, and I still didn't understand it. So I went to ChatGPT and I asked it, invent a new word for equanimity. That will help me understand it in a new way. So the word that it came up with was equiluminance. Mm-hmm. And this equiluminance is essentially the idea of equal light. Mm-hmm. The way that I envision this is that we all have almost like an Edison light bulb,
Right.
in our
Right.
chest.
Right.
And what that light bulb does is shine an equal amount of compassion and understanding on us, but also on the rest of the world and the universe as well. Even if you're 100,000 miles away, you can still feel that light. So that can be a form of activism or of engaged Buddhism as well, is to be able to see that the more compassion that you have for yourself and for understanding that you have light, that can be shared with the rest of the world.
Thank you for the remark.
Equiluminance.
Equiluminous. Buddhists always have this hand gesture when they greet each other. Do you know what that means? Well, it comes from the Indian custom. It means that I use my luminous mind, the most sacred part of my being, to greet yours. So, which is what I think you just shared about this respect for equiluminous. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. There's another question. Yes?
I have a question about the role of women in Buddhism.
Role of women, yes.
Can you hear me? Okay. We're sitting in a room filled with women and a few men, so that's always the elephant in the room. So,
The role of women. So,
Sorry, the role of women. Sorry.
right. So we talked about class differences, the caste system in India. And when I said that, I was primarily referring to men. Okay? So men who had certain jobs that would define the class in the society, and then the offsprings would carry on this job or career. Okay? What about women? Well, traditionally, women do not play any role in any religious practice. Okay? Women are not allowed. No, I mean in the Indian practice, in a Vedic tradition, if a woman in the past, if they happened accidentally heard a sacred verse from the Vedas, they could be punished to death by pouring molten lead into their ears. They were not allowed, even when the Vedas were printed, they were not allowed to hold the book, the sacred text in their hands. Women have no part to play in the Vedic practice, right? And therefore, they had no hope to attain any liberation. In other words, the best that they could hope for is to be reborn as a man in the next life. I'm sorry to say this, but the Buddhist Sangha was one of the first which allowed female monastics. Okay? And interesting also that the Buddha endorsed a few female disciples to have attained enlightenment, and even said that they attained the same level of enlightenment as he did. So he did not see himself as superior than the female, fully endorsing the spiritual potential of the women. Okay, so that's theoretically how Buddhism began, but I'm sorry to say that, as Buddhism developed in different countries, because of the cultural impact on the religion, you could also see gender inequality within the Buddhist communities as well. So there are, for example, a precept, which I firmly believe that was developed much later on, that says that even if you, as a Buddhist nun who has been ordained for many decades, for a very long time, you should still consider yourself as inferior to a monk who has just been ordained for just one day. Okay, so you can see, I'm sorry, but it's culture. It's a way we have been seeing things like that for a very long time. And I believe in socially engaged Buddhism. They are trying so much to bring the equality, equanimity between the two genders. Yes?
Would the woman in the household be the holder of the religion, as it is in so many, following the practices and passing them on to her children?
You mean in the past or in the modern times?
Either, both.
In the past, I would say, especially in the context of the Indian culture or even Chinese culture, females would play the role as the housekeepers. They do not really engage themselves as deeply as the males in their pursuit of enlightenment. So that's unfortunate. Okay? But in the modern times, I'm seeing a lot of Buddhist communities that are allowing female to play a leading role. Okay? So one of the publications that I did in the recent years is about how the Taiwanese Buddhist nuns became, leaders of many of the Buddhist organizations. But that is also because, the ratio between nuns and monks are like this. So, social and cultural kind of changes would allow the nuns to become more engaged, be more respectful, and to have more education, receive more education so that they are respected as being equals to the monks these days. Okay? All right? Okay. Well, let me... Sorry.
Good. One more, and then...
Okay, sure,
Then
sure.
go. We'll make sure you get your work. Yeah.
First of all, I want to thank you. I've read this gentleman's work for years, and I had no idea how to pronounce his name. And if I've got it right, it's Thich Nhat Hanh. Is that
That's
correct?
correct.
Okay,
That's
great.
correct.
That's
Thich Nhat Hanh.
just opened up a whole new world for me. engaged Buddhism resonates for me, and all of the Christian words and descriptions and how you've spoken of humility and justice and courage, et cetera, really resonate with me personally. One of the reasons I come to this church is that I have a very strong interest in the reconciliation movement in this country, capital R, right? What really drew me to it and what intrigues me the most is that we are not apologizing and moving through something that happened 300 years ago. The last residential school closed in 1996 when I was only 26 years old.
Right.
I can't help but think, while those all resonate for me as both a practicing Buddhist and a practicing Christian, while they resonate with me personally, I can't help but think that we're dealing with something that's actually very new. It's not old in our own young history as Canada. I can't help but think that if the leadership of our Christian institutions had lightened up a little bit on their humility, their justice, their courage, and instead took some practices from those that went in the hills, sat cross-legged, and went introspective in order to eradicate their own self-grasping ignorance, that maybe we wouldn't be in the position we are today with the with our Indigenous cultures and groups of people in this country.
Yeah, yeah. So I think the word that comes to mind is privilege. So we all, sitting here in this room, in this sacred space, we already have all kinds of privilege that allows us to be here. And sometimes we are not aware of the privilege that we inherit. And that sometimes is the issues among the Christians too. You know, as you said, it's sometimes that was done so long ago and maybe before my birth, why should I be responsible for those? But what they are not aware is the privilege that is a legacy of the kind of oppression, the kind of wrong things that they have done to the indigenous communities. Okay? And this is not something that the Buddhists have thought a lot about. Well, let me say that, for example, in Taiwan, the Taiwanese also had their indigenous people, their indigenous practices. But in recent decades, when Buddhism became so popular in Taiwan, I'm seeing kind of a similar situation when the indigenous practices were overshadowed by the Buddhist practice, but the Buddhists were not thinking about any kind of reconciliation or any way to mend their relationships with the indigenous people or to respect their traditions and culture. So this is also a way that I think we should think deeply about reconciliation. My colleague at Emmanuel College, Professor Jennifer Bright, was working on a paper about the Buddhist approach to reconciliation in Canada. So I think it is a bit sophisticated because many Buddhists are not white Christians. Many Buddhists are immigrants. Okay? So how do they see themselves as immigrants in relation to this land that was originally belonging to the indigenous people? So I look forward to her paper, but thank you for your question. I think we have to think deeply about the privilege that we inherit, whatever your ethnic background or religious background might be. Okay? All right, let me continue a bit. We still have about half an hour, so I'll finish mine in maybe 15 minutes so that we have some time for questions. So maybe the next slide, please. The meaning of liberation within Buddhism begins to expand in that way, the ways that we just talked about. It is not just about personal enlightenment, it is also about collective well-being. It is about addressing the structural causes of suffering. And this shift has opened the door to new possibilities. It is only because of this important evolution that programs such as the Emmanuel programs that I shared with you earlier, the Buddhism stream of the Master of Psycho-Spiritual Care, how to train students to become Buddhist chaplains, to serve our community. Those programs are available as a result of these new possibilities. This blending of Buddhist contemplative wisdom with the socially engaged principles learned from Christianity has opened new pathways for spiritual care. Today, we see Buddhist practitioners actively engaged in areas like environmental activism, human rights advocacy, and social justice movements. Buddhist chaplains are also serving in hospitals, prisons, the military, and universities, offering spiritual care that responds not only to individual suffering, but also to the broader social conditions that shape it. But let me call your attention to this name, Buddhist chaplains. It is a sign that Buddhists are already learning from the Christians. They call themselves chaplains, and you know chaplains, the word has a deep history within Christianity. So Buddhists are also learning from the principles of Christian palliative care, pioneered by figures like Cicely Saunders. Very, very important works were done that laid the foundation of modern hospice care. So I named some of these here. I won't read them out for you, but if you're interested, I can share the slides with all of you. But the point that I want to make, because of the interest of our time, is that inspired by this model, we now have Buddhist contemplative care, which serves people from all walks of life. It is a form of spiritual care shaped by Buddhist teachings, but also enriched by the Christian teachings and by the Buddhist meditation practices, grounded in a compassionate response to human suffering. This evolution is also reflected in my own work. So I'm currently involved in a project that I called the Buddhist approach to dementia care. Okay? So if you look up on Amazon or the libraries, there are quite a few books on Christian approach to dementia care. And I began interested in this project because I was participating in a multi-faith panel on dementia. And one of the participants was Reverend Kenneth Carter, who recently, at the time when I was participating in that panel, published a book. I think the title of the book was Ministry with the Forgotten. And what was in the first chapter or two in that book really touched me. He talked about the experience of his wife, with whom they have been serving their church for more than 30 years. And then one day, he noticed that his wife was being uncomfortable in the church. And he did not ask why, but back at home, when they finally arrived home, the wife asked him, who was that Jesus that they kept mentioning? So they have been practicing Christianity for life, but when Alzheimer's kicks in, that's the kind of situation that we have to face. But also, the bigger question is a theological one. What if a Christian has forgotten Jesus? Is salvation still available to these people? So that is a very, very insightful book that I would recommend all of you to read. My mother also has Alzheimer's for around 15 years. So we went through the entire journey of her disease. She passed away in 2023, slightly less than 2 years ago. Well, tomorrow is actually her birthday, so I'm honored to be here talking about her. And I think part of the reasons why I am interested in that project on Buddhist approach to dementia care is that there are things that I wish I knew better, during the course of my caring for her. And I think that there is something definitely that Buddhism can contribute to dementia care. So it is not like a Buddhist work. It is not only written for Buddhists. But I think there are ways that I can share this wisdom and compassion, that comes from the Buddhist tradition that could benefit not only the dementia patients, those who are living with dementia, but also the caregivers as well. Those who are caring for someone that they love, but who are living with dementia. Okay. So this is, from my understanding, is an unprecedented area of exploration within the Buddhist world. And yet, as I walk this path, I know I'm following the footsteps of Christian pioneers who have shown us what it means to care for the most vulnerable with dignity, with love, and with courage. So as we reflect on these themes, humility, justice, courage, and what else? Ecumenism. And there may be one more name that I want to focus on, a name that is not found in Buddhism, but it is all too familiar to all of us. The next slide, please. And that's the word forgiveness. You might find it surprising that the word is not found in Buddhism. I was surprised too. It is, as I reflect more, theologically, it is a Christian term. In the context of Buddhist teachings, what we found focused is on qualities like how to address angers and resentment. So the opposites of aggression, that's how, forgiveness is usually understood. But there is no name as quote unquote forgiveness. The following slide, please. So in Buddhism, there are, what they call the Buddhist notions of good or wholesome mental qualities, mental states. And usually when they talk about wholesome mental states, they are referring to the mental states that are characterized by non-greed, non-hatred, and non-delusion. And what is, of course, considered as unwholesome are greed, hatred, and delusion. So the following slide, please. And therefore, in some works within Buddhism, there are very detailed analysis about these wholesome mental states. And they came up with, in the so-called Abhidharma literature, they came up with 10 factors that are considered to arise with a good, wholesome mind. And you can see some of, the list here that includes faith, energy, which is, something related to the idea of courage. The kind of energy that is specifically targeted against our delusions, our, habitual tendencies to do wrong things and so on. Shame at doing evil things. Decorum, or to think twice about the consequences of the things that we do. Non-attachment, non-aggression, calmness, equanimity, conscientiousness, and non-injuriousness. So that's the list, and you don't find the word forgiveness there. So forgiveness is not considered as one of these good, wholesome mental states. So let's pause on that for a moment. What the Buddhists have is the opposite of being angry at someone, or sometimes not being cruel to someone. But not getting angry in the Buddhist tradition means more than simply suppressing feelings of frustration. It is about refraining from the wish to retaliate or cause harm in response to hurt. It is a conscious refusal to let our pain be recycled into more pain. And not being cruel goes a step further. It is not just about avoiding harm. It is about cultivating compassion, the sincere wish for others and ourselves to be free from suffering and the cause of suffering. This is where the Buddhist response to harm and hurt takes root, not in punishment, not in judgment, but in compassion. So when you take these together, you can find that the notion, the idea of forgiveness is there. It's that, only that, they do not have that name. So at its core, forgiveness is about, well, the Buddhist perspective is about differentiating the person from their actions. So you're not angry at the person who did something wrong to you. You should reflect on the relationship that you have with that person and what caused this resentment and so on. So it's not about the person. It's about recognizing that harmful behaviors don't arise because someone is inherently bad. Rather, they emerge from confusion, from that kind of ugly relationships between you and the other person. Like to skip ahead. So therefore, forgiveness should be an act of release, not because we have the authority to pardon, but because we have the wisdom to let go. It is a recognition that holding on to anger, resentment, or self-recrimination only binds us more tightly to suffering. Forgiveness is not about excusing harm. It is about freeing ourselves from the chains of resentment builds. So this is, once again, I believe Buddhism has something to learn from Christianity. So let me quickly mention that in Christian teachings, forgiveness is not just a personal release. It is a sacred act. It is woven into the very heart of faith. So, coming from my prayers in the days at Raimondi College, there are these verses that we recite. Forgive us for our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. So I am well aware of this phrase. Forgiveness here is not a passive absence of anger. It is an active practice of grace, a reflection of God's boundless mercy. It is transformative both for the one who forgives and the one who is forgiven. So let me conclude. We have a bit, maybe let me conclude in 2 minutes. I should make it clear that it is not that Buddhism turns a blind eye to issues like hatred or injustice and things like that. It is not that Buddhist practitioners lack courage or that they don't practice forgiveness or that they are indifferent to social suffering that surrounds us. In fact, I've suggested that Buddhists could learn from Christians. Well, what Buddhists could learn from Christians are already present in the sacred texts of the Buddhist traditions. The difference lies in how these teachings are being emphasized. In many Buddhist traditions, these concepts are present, but they are not always highlighted with the same clarity, focus, or language that we often find in Christianity. They exist, yes, but they are like precious gems embedded deep within the scriptures, sometimes overlooked, unless one digs with great care and attention. It often takes someone who has not only studied these teachings but has gained a profound personal realization of them to truly embody these values in their life. It is not that wisdom is not there, it is that scriptures don't always shine a spotlight on these ideas with specific names, calling them out as central, identifiable virtues to be cultivated explicitly. So in Buddhism, these teachings are often framed differently. Without specific names to draw our attention, these qualities can sometimes remain in the background, implicit rather than explicit, known but not always emphasized. That's why interfaith dialogue can be so powerful. It allows us to see our own traditions with fresh eyes. It helps us recognize the treasures we have always had, but perhaps haven't fully appreciated. The next slide, please. Buddhism has much to offer the world. I believe in that. With its deep teachings on mindfulness, compassion, and the nature of suffering. All of those are, very unique. But it also has much to learn as well about how to stand alongside the oppressed, how to engage with the messy realities of social injustice, and how to expand the meaning of liberation to include not just freedom from samsara, but freedom from the very real chains of injustice that still bind so many in our world today. It is a shared journey where we inspire, challenge, and support one another in the sacred work of compassion, justice, and healing. And in this sacred space of learning, we find not only wisdom, but the grace to grow together. The final slide. Thank you. And I picked this picture because I think it's a two-way highway, so that we can have that kind of mutual borrowing, learning from each other.
We have 14 minutes.
Okay.
What did you hear? Because we have 14 minutes to question. You got 60 seconds. Somebody near you. What did you hear?
Just talk with your neighbors.
You got 1 minute to talk to people, then we'll take questions.
Yeah.
Yep. Okay, just 30 seconds. Okay, we had a question here. Here you go.
Thank you very much. That was great. For me, a way in is understanding that we have different worldviews, and that for Indigenous populations, I can't speak that much to Eastern populations, but there is a division between, as we kind of call it, East and Western ways of understanding the world. So oral tradition is very rooted in Indigenous ways of understanding. For example, there isn't a specific word for snow. There's many, many different words for snow. So it takes a whole ability to do a mindset shift, I think, to really, as you mentioned, deeply understand other people's worldviews and ways of knowing. And that takes a lot of patience, a lot of compassion, a lot, because what we are seeing is, and I'm coming from I've grown up in a Western civilizations. My aunt was a nun who I think, unfortunately, was at one of the residential schools in Saskatchewan. But I've come out of a social justice base. I've worked for an international aid agency from human rights, concerned about actually human rights in Central America. So I had the opportunity of living in a base Christian community in Mexico to understand how they used the word, rooting their living the word of Jesus, to organize to bring clean water and electricity to the barrio that they were based in. So there are ways into, I think, not just boiling things down and siloing things. I think there is a great importance in naming things. That's a whole nother discussion. This is just, for me, quite difficult to boil down everything into one situation. But I also I have been a practicing member of the Soka Gakka International, and where I could see so many parallels with Christian liberation theology and the Soka Gakka International, which I think you're called engaged Buddhism, which is understanding that you can be a Bodhisattva right now. Same with liberation theology. You can experience salvation or realization in the here and now. You don't have to wait to die and be saved to get salvation. So I guess for me, what I'm trying to articulate is just getting back to your differentiation. I mean, through history, priests in Christianity were the keepers of the written word. They were the ones transcribing things into words. And so the clash that happened when these different worldviews encountered each other, unfortunately, Western ways of understanding had it organized, and so it circulates into a different way of understanding the value of the land, the value of things. It is a very linear way of understanding, I hate to say it, in Christianity for me, and with a lot of deistic religions, as opposed to a more holistic understanding that you can't, good and evil coexist. You can't ever fully eliminate evil for good. You know, these labels don't exist in different worldviews. They have an understanding that they coexist. So, sorry, thanks for listening to my ramble.
Okay, I love that, but we really like questions, if that's okay. John, because we have an expert here. We want to put him on this. John.
Thank you very much for your very generous presentation. Just could you comment on the predicament of Buddhism in China today, perhaps especially the engaged Buddhism, if there is any, in contemporary China?
Am I on? Can you hear me? Yes? Yeah, that's good. Let me respond very quickly to the earlier comment, and then I'll come to engaged Buddhism in China. Okay. So I thank you for your insights, what you shared. You highlighted the term oral tradition, oral teachings. I think that is also very important within the Buddhist tradition as well. And I think the way that, well, we had also an earlier conversation during the break about University of Calgary, about religious studies, why we are interested in religious studies and so on. I came from that background at the U of T, at the U of Toronto, from the Department of Religious Studies. So I came from the tradition of studying religion from the perspective as an outsider, to study the history and the texts of that religion. So that's all is important for us. Only things that are written down, only things that are available through scriptures would be considered as historical teachings. But there are so many teachings that are not written down. So that emphasis on textual, historical documents is a very Eurocentric way of approaching our understanding of religion. And, there is, of course, arrogance, embedded with that approach. There is this, the supremacy that they would see themselves as, against, let's say, the indigenous tradition, who maybe in their views might not have developed into the stage to have their teachings written down. But that's really wrong understanding. So I respect the oral traditions a lot. And, we have a slide on a theologian, Dean William Fern, about Third World liberation theology. And I think he was writing in another book about how theologies in different communities are shaped by their own language, by their own culture, by their own spiritual needs. And there is no one single theology that can apply to everyone. Okay, so that would be my kind of response for you. About religion in China, that's a hot topic. I don't really know how to respond to that. You know how the Chinese government works. There are a lot of control over many aspects of people's lives, and religion is one of them. But even within that kind of control, there are amazing works that the Buddhists have done over the years. So engaged Buddhism was reintroduced or back introduced from Taiwan to China, so that there are Buddhist communities that are going out to serve the general public, to provide, for example, hospice care, palliative care, to maybe offering like a Buddhist hospitals or something. So they use their resources in ways to make it available, to make the resources, to make the privileges available to those people who are in need. So things like that can be found in China. But maybe I should say that it's more thoroughly developed in Taiwan.
Okay. Anybody? I want to ask you, I think you're really generous with Christianity. Because I see so much Christianity that I want to fight with and disregard.
I understand that. Well, my colleague Nestor Medina is coming in a few weeks, I think.
Yes.
Well, we were talking about our classroom experience. I joke that I criticize Buddhism a lot in my classrooms. And he said, as a Christian, he also criticized Christianity a lot in his classrooms. I think being a practitioner of the traditions allows us to see things from a different perspective, so that when we criticize, we are not doing so out of misunderstanding or out of any polemic need to say that my tradition is better than yours.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so here's my question. So then, we read in the paper this week that Donald Trump is setting up I'll call it this, I'm not sure what it's called, but a faith office, if you will, but it's basically a Christian, an attempt to impose Christianity as the religion. How do you feel when you hear that kind of, that's not humility, that's arrogance, I would say. Yeah. And how do we respond? So that's my last question. And you got 1 minute.
Well, I think Donald Trump is he personified arrogance.
Yes.
Okay, he is the symbol of arrogance. And a way of response is that we oftentimes would hope for wise, compassionate leaders in our spiritual community to guide us in our practice. But sometimes the opposite can work equally well. So we are sometimes seeing the bad examples that would prompt us to go to the opposite direction, so that we see how arrogance can do harm to ourselves and others. So that would be how I would react to, politically we don't have much that we can do against his administration, but I think spiritually speaking, on the level of our own spiritual practice, there's so much we can learn from the opposite of his arrogance.
Okay, thank you.
Yes.
Thank you. I just asked Tim Tamashiro to thank you on our behalf and to say a few words.
Henry, thank you very much.
Thank you.
You've helped us be able to see things from a variety of different perspectives. Wisdom is a diamond that we can see from many different facets and understand that light is going to refract differently for each one of us. So you've helped us understand both Christianity and Buddhism, and both darkness and in light. But it's all part of our own learning, and it's all part of the way that we're going to be able to find our own way forward. So I want to thank you on behalf of everybody here for coming and spending time with us today so generously, and for spending a morning with us, bringing us context, if nothing else. And so from the bottom of our hearts, thank you.
No, thank you for your kind words. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Henry. Henry will be here with us tomorrow at 9 and 10:45. We want to honor your time. I want to thank you for taking part of your weekend to be here, to be engaged with Henry and with others in our midst. That, indeed, I believe is how compassion is lived and grown among us. So thank you for being with us. And if you're wondering, how do we afford this? It's because people make gifts of offering. So our offering throughout the year helps us provide opportunity to do this and be engaged. So you're free now. Thank you for being with us, and hope you'll be with us tomorrow. So thank you.
Thank you for having me. Thank you. Yeah.